West Florida Public Library presents Explore Pensacola History, a lecture series highlighting more than 450 years of Escambia County's history. Join us as we explore the people, places, and events that make up our area's unique heritage. Major funding for Explore Pensacola History was provided through a grant from the Florida Humanities Council with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording do not necessarily represent those of the Florida Humanities Council or the National Endowment for the Humanities. Additional funding was provided by the Friends of West Florida Public Library, whose ongoing generosity provides these and other first-class programs to the people of Escambia County. For more information or to become a friend of the library, visit them online at friendsofwfpl.org.
Well, welcome. How many of y'all, this is your fourth one? Isn't that cool? Y'all are just so educated. How many, this is your first one? What's in between 1 and 4? 2, second and third. Okay, all righty. So we got highly educated, and then like me, this is my first one. Well, I am excited. I'm really excited that the library has, in this new facility and all this creative spirit that we have around Pensacola, is going right back home and going to all of the other things, as Mike said, in Pensacola. There are some amazing things in Pensacola. I met people in Molino that I'm just dying to get that history up there. I've met people in the tan yard. And the 2 reasons, do y'all know about the tan yard? Yeah, why was the tan yard called the tan yard? Tan yard is south of Cervantes Street, between the Cervantes, Garden Street, between Garden Street and the water, just west of downtown. Why was it called the tan yard?
Yeah, to make sure two different cultures people.
Yeah. So that's the first one I heard. That's the funniest. That's the best one. So they said the tan yards because the gentlemen were coming off the ships, and then the women were right there. So okay, I don't need to say no more. The color of the skin. But the other real reason is because there was the tan yard down. There was a leather shop down there. They have some wonderful pictures with the Historical Society. But in the first one, the best story though, I think. So that's what you're going to see tonight. You're going to see some lots of facts, and you're going to see some opinions. And I think that's what makes a documentary a documentary. So you go for the truth, and then you let life happen. I decided to do this documentary because I fell in love with Belmont Devillers about 20 years ago. I'm originally not from this area. I'm not a historian, not a researcher, but I love folks. I love stories. My dad loved history. My mom was a teacher, so just got that blend of it. Love reading. And I love who I am, everything about who I am. And so I thought, when I started looking I went through Leadership Pensacola years ago, the West Florida Leadership Senior Academy, all of these things, and I did not find out about the whole of Pensacola. And so my parents always told me, well, if you're going to talk about a problem, you got to talk about a solution. Okay. Sometimes that's fun. Other times, 2 years later, that's not. And so that's why I wanted to go on this quest to talk to people about the story of this amazing place. So who know where Belmont Devillers is? Yeah, because you've been to Five Sisters. Yeah. And the Gumbo Galler, which never serves gumbo. Yeah, yeah. What are some of the other places that you know about in Belmont Devillers? Blue Dot. Yeah. What does Blue Dot serve for those who haven't been there? Hamburgers and attitude. The attitude is free. You know what I told him when I interviewed Byron? I said Byron Long is the owner now. that I asked him about the recipe for the burger, and so he gave me attitude. He's like, if I give it to you, nobody else will come here. But I asked him, and I've heard people call him this, the burger Nazi. Y'all watch Seinfeld, the soup Nazi, they call him the burger Nazi. So I said, Byron, I said, why are you like that? He said, because it's about business. I have to deliver that burger. It's not like you have a choice. You got a burger, okay, you don't know this. They serve ribs 2 days a week. Spare ribs. All right, Mr. Gully. 2 days a week, and you have to get there between 11:30 and 12 or they're all gone. Yeah. And he will put a sign on the door, no ribs today if they're all gone. Sometimes. But yeah, so it's, what else in Belmont Devillers do you know?
It used to be called Truth for Youth.
Truth for Youth, the Belmont building. They just changed the name to the Belmont Cultural Center. Yeah, Belmont Cultural Center, which used to be what? This is my boyfriend right here, Mr. Gully, so he can't answer any more questions. Used to be Smith Bakery. That's right. You didn't sneak in like everybody else? You looked underage, huh? What else was there? Belmont Art Center, which is where Smith Bakery was. Yeah. What else? 506 Club. Did y'all party together? 506 and the Savoy were linked up. There was a black hospital there in Belmont Devillers between 23 and 24. It's probably built a little bit before that. A lady by the name of Miss Edwards. What was her first name? Viola Edwards, I believe. Between 23 and 24, there was a black hospital there. Remember, and what I'm going to show you today is about the first 25 minutes of the documentary. So it talks about how the neighborhood became what we now know as Belmont Devillers and the folks who laid the foundation of it there. We'll take you right up through what we know as the Jim Crow era and why it really then African Americans, blacks, Negroes, colored, Afro Americans, and you hear all of those terms in here, really then started to move from the downtown area, the businessmen and women, to that area. So there were black doctors that were there, black doctors, Jewish merchants, Filipino merchants that were there. So it was a hodgepodge of a neighborhood in terms of culture, in terms of attitudes, in terms of ideas. And so it was the colored section of the neighborhood. So I'm going to show you this first one, and then I'll invite questions after that. So I don't forget, here's the advertisement part. We do have the full DVD, which is about an hour and a half. We're doing 2 for $20 tonight or 1 for $15. And we also have the soundtrack to it, which you'll hear a little bit of that tonight. All original music, mostly original music. There is two older songs on there from right here on the coast. So I'm going to start it, and I hope you enjoy.
How long, baby, tell me how long, oh, how long, tell me how long, yeah, that evening train been gone. Please tell me how long. Ain't that right? If I could holler like a mountain jack, I'll go up on the mountain, call my baby back. But how long? Please tell me how long. Had an evening train been gone? How long? How long? Oh, tell me how long. Woke up this morning by the break of day. Have my head on a pillow where my baby used to lay, but it's so gone. Please tell me how long. Well, how long? Yes, how long? Tell me how long have that evening train been gone? Oh, how long? How long? Well, how long? All right, Willie James. Well, tell me how long. Yeah, baby. Oh, baby, baby. How long? Tell me how long? How long?
In most of the South after the Civil War, African Americans had to go about the business of building their independent lives. In most of the South, but not so much in Florida, and not so much in the Panhandle, and not so much in Pensacola, and most certainly not in the Belmont Devillers. Their challenge was not to build their neighborhood. Their challenge was to keep their neighborhood. Built around the last half of the 19th century, the Belmont Devillers neighborhood was mostly a community of residential houses with some businesses scattered between. Skilled tradesmen of all colors and hues worked side by side in the shipyards, lumber yards, on the railroad, and at the piers, alongside women and men who served as the retail, medical, and tourism foundation. In the beginning of the 20th century, the Jim Crow laws changed the face of the downtown area the labor unions and the social welcome mat. The black business owners moved a half a mile from the main business district, and Belmont Devillers became a vibrant neighborhood with a strong business core in a resilient residential neighborhood. In this neighborhood, both the elders and the young seek the same thing: a sense of place. This is the future that over a century ago, the country envisioned.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible with sword. His truth is marching on.
Brother against brother, family against family. 200,000 African American men and women fought with the country as they fought each other for 4 years beginning in 1861 over the question of states' rights and slavery. They were fighting for themselves. In the deadliest battle of the young nation, 40,000 African American men and some women met their freedom in the grave. The Civil War raged on. By May of 1862, the Union had taken hold of the forts in Pensacola. On January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation opened up the military to colored men. 25-year-old John Sunday was one of those colored men, enlisting and eventually becoming a sergeant in Company K of the 78th Regiment. This was one of the 30 Negro regiments commissioned for the war effort. John Sunday started life in slavery. His father, also named John, immigrated from Amsterdam, landed in Georgia, then eventually settled in the north end of the county along the Escambia River. Today, it is Santa Rosa County. The planned expansion of the railroad from Georgia to Florida may have spurred his move south, looking for better business opportunities. He brought his wife, his children, and about 8 to 10 slaves from Georgia, and bought a sawmill on the river. The wife of John Sunday, the father, died in childbirth. Jenny, a slave, was her caretaker. There is a question about whether John, the father, and Jenny married. Rumors swirl. What is known is that they had 4 children together: Harrison, Amanda Mercedes, David, and John.
My name is Pearl Perkins. I am the great-great-granddaughter of John Sunday, who was a large property owner in Pensacola. Jenny, of course, was John Jr.'s mom. She was a slave of John Sr., and John Sr. took Jenny in at a very early age, a young age, because of the fact that she was not accepted in the nowadays in the black community because of her complexion, and was not accepted in the white community because of her complexion. So he took her in as a kind of like a day maid or a housemaid to help him and his first wife, who apparently they had quite a few children too. And when she passed away, the first wife passed away, he took Jenny in, and according to the records, oral history from my grandmother indicated that Jenny and John was married. Of course, we don't have any concrete proof of that, only just the testimony that John Jr. gave my grandmother that his mom and John Sunday, the white John Sunday, was married. And he gave Jenny as a wedding gift, because he asked, what do you want for a wedding gift? And he gave her her freedom along with her 4 children, her 4 mulatto children, which was John Jr., David, Amanda, which we know as Mercedes Sunday Ruby, and Harrison Sunday. The record show that John Sr. was murdered, assassinated by a black slave. That's according to the information, according to records, articles that was in the paper. And then it comes back, and it also indicated that Jenny and 2 or 3 of the other slaves, along with his children, was present when John Sr. was shot in his own home. Of course, there's another twist to the story where that my grandmother said that her dad said that he was murdered by his own white children because it was a jealousy of him keeping Jenny and her 4 children in the home house, and they was quite resentful of that. So that's one side of the story. Well, it's 2 scenarios to that story. Of course, we don't have anything but what's documented, that he was murdered by a slave named Adam, shot in the head. Of course, there was documents that was apparently John Sr. had already filed in the courts where he had freed Jenny. Upon his death, it's recorded here in Pensacola in the record books that is titled Freedom Slavery, and it's a document where he is freeing Jenny and her 4 children upon his death. There's a couple of scenarios that run through my mind. Maybe he couldn't possibly bear the thought of anybody bringing harm to his black children, or he could have just been that much in love with Jenny at the time that he granted her what she wanted, and he didn't want those 4 children sold off as slaves at the time. So of course, upon his death, they was freed. Of course, there was court actions, court documents that showed that his white children did not want Jenny and the 4 children to be freed. They went to court several times, and there were some of his older children and their spouses was in contempt of court because they refused to let them go, claiming that they was property of John Sunday.
By virtue of the authority in us vested as the administrators of the estate of John Sunday, deceased, we shall, on Saturday the 8th day of June next, at 12 o'clock midday, at the late residence of the deceased, sell at public auction to the highest bidder, on a credit of 6 months with approved security, the following described Negro slaves belonging to the estate of said deceased, to wit, Adam, age 24 years, Jack, 23 years, Tracy, 26 years, and her 3 children, Calvin, 8 years, Martha, 5 years, and Henry, 2 years, and also Anna, a mulatto girl about 12 years old. The above-named slaves are acclimated and healthy. Elijah McCurdy, William S.B. Owens, administrators. May 11th, 1839.
And by all of this information being already pre-recorded prior to his death, they had no choice, and they was mandated by the judge to let them go free. And this, I assume, was up in the upper part or the north end of the Escambia River, and the courts here being in Escambia County, Pensacola, I'm thinking that they had to come in and appear in court, and they did. And at that point, the judge said, they're free to go.
Now 16 years old and free, John found work as an apprentice to a cabinet maker and mortician. He indentured himself for 5 years to faithfully serve and honestly, orderly, and obediently behave himself towards his master. His master, Ambrose Vaughn, could not legally teach him or allow him to be taught spelling, reading, writing, and arithmetic. At the end of his 5-year service, John received new clothes worth $25, half of what was normally paid. 2 years after his indenturement ended, the Civil War began. John enlisted at Fort Barrancas and served the Union for 2 years in and around New Orleans, rising to the rank of sergeant. He returned home to Pensacola with a wife, Seraphine, and 2 children, Samuel and Francis. He found work as a carpenter and raised his family. April of 1865 saw the end of the Civil War, and Florida received its emancipation order on May 14th. After the Civil War, or as some white Southerners called it, the War of Northern Aggression, the United States went into the business of rebuilding itself and its economic base. The nation was in the Reconstruction era, so called because of the effort to rebuild the country and the lives of the millions of the newly freed slaves. Freedmen's bureaus were established throughout the South to help sort the question of land ownership, education, and citizenship. Pensacola was now a blend of Native American, Spanish, English, French, Southern, and African cultures joined together to increase the flow of money into the city.
And between 1865 and 1870, Pensacola was typical of what was going on in the South. There was the original money was worthless, properties had been devalued, businesses had been closed down, inventories were gone, and it was mass confusion trying to put things back together. And this began to change in 1870 with the beginning of what we call the lumbering era. This was the creation of a mass market for lumber in major Western countries of Europe, who all had found that they absolutely had to rebuild their cities because of the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Pensacola, like all of the Gulf Coast and up roughly 125 miles into Alabama, was at the hub of a marvelous 125-mile square forest of virgin yellow pine. And the cutting of the pine and the formation into lumber began in the 1870s. And by the time 5 years had passed, a new prosperity had come to Pensacola. And by the time we get to 1875 and 80, you find great numbers of black men working in the mills, in the forests, in the cutting operations, also in the forests, in the collection of naval stores. A number of them, and of course, then began working on the docks as longshoremen.
The city was also in the midst of Reconstruction and dealt with itself over the results of the defeat of secession and slavery. The political landscape had changed for the African American. No longer considered property, they now could consider and decide upon policies that affected them and their families, their communities, state, and nation. The U.S. Constitution had brought a further sense of freedom to the South, at least on paper. New faces came to state politics. Zebulon Elijah, a customs inspector from the Warrenton community, an area west of Pensacola, represented Escambia County in the Florida House of Representatives from 1871 to 1873. John Sunday followed him, serving from 1874 through 1875. Both Elijah and Sunday served with other African American legislators during and after Reconstruction. Over the next 10 years, John bought more land and houses all around the new city. In December of 1883, he moved his family to a large corner lot that he purchased the year before. Here, he made a home for Seraphine and their 4 sons. Over the next 2 years, he improved the house, built a restaurant, an office, a tenement house, and a 2-story building, putting his Florida grocery store on the first floor and renting out the second floor as a hall. In November of 1887, here on the northwest corner, John Sunday bought his first major stake in the Belmont Devillers neighborhood. He paid $1,500 for these lots on what would become the commercial core of the neighborhood. During the last 2 decades of the 19th century, others with the entrepreneurial spirit started joining Sunday in the downtown area and Belmont Devillers, inspired by the promises of the capital economic system and the Reconstruction era policies. In fact, all over America, African Americans in large numbers took their place in the business world and the political arena, fueled by national movements led by W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. Most of the African American businessmen and women seemed attracted to the model Booker T. Washington set, perhaps highly influenced by Matthew Louis, a friend of Washington's, a lawyer and a decorated Civil War veteran. 46-year-old Louis came to Pensacola from Jacksonville around 1894. He brought with him his wife Bessie, his son John, his daughter Irene, and his 7-year-old paper, the Florida Sentinel, a paper he had started in 1887 in Gainesville. The Louis found a home in Belmont Devillers at 303 North Devillers and settled in the neighborhood. Louis settled his business downtown on North Tarragona Street, renting space from John Sunday and within blocks of other African American business owners. Louis also had statewide influence in the Republican Party, serving in 1896 as its Florida Committee chairman. Like John Sunday, Matthew Louis' influence in business grew. He moved the paper, his printing business, and his employees about 5 blocks west to the corner of Chase and Balin Streets. In the columns of the Florida Sentinel, Louis advocated for and promoted African American businesses. The Belmont Devillers neighborhood grew. Just as the black businesses were growing, so was the influence of Booker T. Washington's ideas and concepts of race, education, and equality. In 1895, at the Atlanta Exposition, Washington's voice reverberated around the nation, and Pensacolians of every color heard his rallying cry for hard work and civil obedience for the Negro and the white Southerner. Matthew Louis served as the head of the Florida contingent of the exposition, and George B. Green, owner of the Escambia Furniture Company on Devillers Street, displayed his furniture and wares in the Negro exhibit hall, showcasing the progress of the Negro.
I remember my grandmother sitting at the kitchen table and telling stories about my mom growing up, and one of the area was this area here on Coral Street, where she said that of course she ended up with this property that was passed on to her by her dad, which was John Sunday III, who is John Sunday's son. And that piece of property came to my grandmother, and my grandmother said they stayed here, and that eventually they moved because they felt like that this was an appropriate place to raise my mom. My mom was frightened most of the time at night and said that this area was, my grandmother confirmed the fact that the area had ghosts and it was haunted. And that was the first time I ever heard the word haunted. And she clarified that the word hainted came from ghost, that you would see ghosts walking in the yard, and they converted the outdoor plumbing into indoor plumbing.
The fishing and lumber industries have been good for Pensacola. The economic opportunities began to attract new people who came to cast their lot in the growing city. The railroads brought Pensacola new exposure and new ideas for development. From Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia they came, and Pensacola welcomed them all. The area now had over 28,000 people. Daniel Cunningham originally came from Alabama and settled in Pensacola with his wife, Florence, a native of Pensacola who was an 1889 graduate of the Tuskegee Institute and a teacher at school number 3. While Florence taught, Daniel set out to build their Excelsior grocery store business in a 2-story building they owned and with their 3 daughters lived in. Their business neighbors on Tarragona Street, or as Daniel called it, the second prominent business thoroughfare in the city, included colored men and women who were barbers, restaurant owners, and even an oyster saloon owner. George Green, who owned the furniture store on Devillers Street, also owned a furniture company next door. Daniel Cunningham, with his 6 employees and his growing real estate portfolio, quickly became influential in the business community, heading the African American Business and Professional Men's Association of Pensacola. According to Cunningham, it was formed for holding annual displays that all might see to what extent we were engaged in business in the professions, and to stimulate an interest and pride among our own people for such enterprise. On May 17, 1900, the association invited Booker T. Washington to Pensacola for its inaugural Afro-American Trades display. It would have been easy for Washington to say yes to Pensacola because of the family influence of Florence Cunningham and Washington's friendship with Matthew Louis, the newspaper publisher. It was a grand day. And the evening must have been grand as well, for the next day's daily newspaper hailed a distinguished visitor, and that a very large audience assembled to listen to the address. The night before, the Black Patty Troubadours had performed their minstrel show on the same stage from which Washington spoke. The Opera House stage seemed to be the common ground for those advocating for the Negro to move forward and those advocating for the Negro to reverse course. One group advocating for the forward movement was the National Negro Business League. Just 3 short months after almost 2,000 Pensacolians heard Washington's words, 200 businessmen and women gathered in Boston, Massachusetts for a national meeting solely focused on the Negro in business. Matthew Louis was on the executive board of the League, which was founded by Dr. Washington. As Washington's secretary, Emmett Scott wrote to emphasize in an organized way what the Negro had done and could do in the way of business achievement in spite of race prejudice. They met August 23rd and 24th. Daniel Cunningham was there. So was Matthew Louis. In a speech before the national crowd, Louis, an advocate for better race relations, touted the Pensacola area as the place to do business. With the Civil War now 3 decades behind them, the former slaves and freed people of color, citizens and business owners alike, looked forward to the dawning of the new century. Others wanted to look back. An undercurrent of continued racial segregation had been steadily moving since the war between the states. Black business and professional men fought the racial stereotypes of the lazy, sex-crazed black man on one hand, and black business and professional women fought the mammy image on the other.
By the time we get into the 1887-88 period, states such as Mississippi and Louisiana have begun to pass state laws that deal with some forms of segregation, whether they be such things as the poll tax, or basically then becoming rules that said there are going to be separate facilities on railroads, in restaurants, barbershops, whatever, for the races. Now this moves very slowly in this direction. And without leaving out a whole lot of the story, I'll just pick up the fact that by the time we get to the year 1898-99, Florida is moving ahead with a law to segregate the races on railroads. And basically they do pass such a law. And by the time we get to the early part of this new century, William Alexander Blunt, who was a very behemoth as an attorney. He was the former president of the American Bar Association, and he was the general counsel of the Florida East Coast Railroad. The new law is passed, which says there will be separate cars for black and white riders.
In 1905, the tides began to turn for African Americans in Pensacola. Success became more segregated. The decision to segregate the races in Pensacola may have begun in 1896 with the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson, a case that rippled across the South to advocate for segregated transportation. In Pensacola, the case found its way to the streetcars. In July 1905, Florida passed a law to require streetcar companies and others in the state to furnish separate cars or divisions for white and colored passengers. It was a crime for disobedience, and there was disobedience. Local citizens, mostly African Americans, were led by Charles Call, a local teacher, in a month-long boycott against the Jim Crow law, until the law was struck down as unconstitutional by the Florida Supreme Court less than a month later.
Mr. Blunt comes forth in a 4th of July speech and said this doesn't make good sense at all, because the railroads can afford to do this and just put another car on the train. They can get along with, but here in Pensacola we've got a streetcar system. This would mean that they would have to run 2 separate streetcars, and if they do that, they'll be out of business. They can't afford to do it. And so an agreement was reached. The city council, at the urging of the Chamber of Commerce, quickly passed a law for segregating passengers on a streetcar.
On August 2nd, the Chamber of Commerce called a special meeting and voted to ask the City Council to pass a local ordinance for streetcar segregation. The meeting was led by T. Albert Jennings, the Chamber's Vice President and President of the Pensacola State Bank, who would later become Speaker of the Florida House of Representatives. The ordinance called for equal accommodation in separate cars or compartments of cars for white and colored passengers. Anyone breaking the law would be fined $25 or jail for 60 days. With only the mayor against it, the city council passed the ordinance on Friday, October 13, 1905. On Saturday, Reverend L.B. Croom, a local evangelist, sat down on a seat in front as a challenge to the local law and was promptly arrested. The case went to trial on Monday, and by Monday afternoon, Reverend L.B. Croom was sentenced to 30 days in jail.
And so this comes into pass, and now this goes bing, 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 and now we suddenly see the segregation passing on to well beyond the school system. This is when you begin to see it put into effect for restaurants, barbershops, and the rest. And it was up to that point Many of the business properties along Palafox or Garden or other major downtown streets had been a kind of a checkerboard. But now with this other segregation movement, landlords who owned the buildings come to their black tenants and say, we're sorry, we can no longer renew your lease, you'll have to go somewhere else.
The lynchings of two accused murderers, Leander Shaw and David Alexander, in downtown Pensacola in 1908 and 1909 by mobs of white men, added to the segregated sentiments. Their killers were never brought to trial. In 1911, a call for segregated housing rumbled. A half-century of Jim Crow had begun. The businessmen and women began to occupy Belmont Devillers even more. The African American Insurance Company moved in around 1910, first opening a branch office at 315 West Wright Street.
What do you think? Yeah? Is it new information? Yes. Good. Good. Yeah. Well, that's always the point. It was chock full of information. I know there's a ton of information there, and it's taken me. I was telling Mike every time I watch it, it's like giving birth again. I mean, I love my 3 children, but it's just like giving birth again. But it is, and I love the with all the historians, John Appleyard. I mean, everyone who's written a book about Pensacola. All the different layers of history in it, that there are those layers of history, and I've grown to appreciate that. One of the things I do want to point out is I don't when you saw the and this is always so 2 things. One, we did a showing I think at UWF or somewhere, and the lady came up to me and she said, Amber Vaughn was black. And I said, no, remember Amber Vaughn was the caretaker. He was the master of John Sunday when he was had been manumitted. Well, and I haven't looked that up, but I do know that there were African Americans, black, Negro, colored, who owned slaves and who were in control of other African Americans after the Civil War. Pensacola is one of those places where you had to have don't remember what they didn't call them masters, but you had to have essentially a caretaker if you were a person of color, a free person of color. You had to have someone who said you were okay.
Blacks couldn't sign contracts without a white, basically.
What were they called though? What was a white person called? It wasn't a master, but it was something floating in between.
Like a sponsor.
A sponsor. I think they called him a sponsor. Thank you. Yeah, call him a sponsor. Yeah. So that was one thing. The other thing was that when we talked about Black Patty, the interesting thing about Black Patty was she was an opera singer. She was very well known in Europe, but when she came back to America, she couldn't find jobs, and so she started doing minstrel shows. The neat thing was, and we have lots of documentation on this, at the end of her minstrel show, which a lot of African Americans wrote in order to make money, she would belt out this huge opera song at the end to show them, this is really what I want to do, but this minstrel show is what I have to do. Right? So what they say in the Great Debaters, do what you have to do so you can do what you want to. You can do what you want to do. Thank you. If you don't know each other, meet each other and enjoy each other. And have no Hanukkah's gone. Have a wonderful Christmas and Kwanzaa and 3 Kings Day.